The team with the most talent usually wins. That's why finding and developing great players is crucial for every franchise. Today we'll ask 3 questions. Is the NCAA the best option for young athletes, or does it take more than it gives? Can a set of numbers generated by a computer give you a more accurate assessment of a player than the trained scout? And what can be done to keep your most valuable assets out of the trainer's room? On this episode of the Sports Business Show, The Player Pipeline. This is the story of a video game, a lawsuit, and the future of sports in North America.
I was at a friend's house, and his son was playing a video game, a college basketball game, and it featured my team, my '95 championship team.
EA Sports makes a video game that lets you play as great teams from history, including the '95 UCLA Bruins.
There I was, number 31, and my brother and my teammates, and I was thrilled. I was excited about it. Later on, my friend says, we paid $60 for this game and you didn't get a penny. He was just kind of making a joke, a friendly joke. It wasn't really a big deal. In fact, we laughed about it. My wheels started turning. Wow, I can't believe, here I am, my mid-30s, and the NC2A and various other companies are still profiting off of my likeness.
O'Bannon took the role of lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against the NCAA. The suit called for college athletes to retain their individual marketing rights.
My biggest thing was to bring awareness. Say, hey, you can't profit off of my likeness without at least asking me.
When you talk about money and college athletes, most of the conversation revolves around men's football and basketball, but they represent a tiny fraction of the 460,000 NCAA athletes.
Fact that the defender...
You're talking about less than 1% that even have the brand ability to take on naming rights.
That means changing the rules would have a very narrow impact.
I think the sun would actually come up the next day. A lot of these kids have huge social media followings. They'll be able to profit off of their own names. And believe it or not, they would go to practice the next day.
The ones that are most talented are going to rise to the top and be coveted by the brands. And then other people, if they're smart, if they're aggressive, they're going to find their sponsors, and some people won't.
It might even teach some valuable lessons.
When I went pro, I was 22 years old. I thought I was old. I thought I knew what I was doing, and I didn't know anything.
The world of business would open up to them. They would now have an opportunity to actually market themselves and make money and save money, spend money, save money. However, it's yours.
And when that switch happens, when you go from being an amateur NCAA level athlete where, you cannot accept endorsement money, you cannot represent brands except your university, to all of a sudden, boom, you're a professional athlete. Now you have to do this for a living, you have to make money, and your perception and your idea of your image and what you want to portray completely shifts.
Winning individual marketing rights is an important issue, but there's a bigger one. Getting paid by the colleges they represent. NCAA athletes get their tuition paid for, but nothing more.
It's a very simple thing. The NCAA is basically a group of colleges that have come together and agreed that they won't pay players. And at the most basic level, that's an antitrust violation.
It's not because they can't afford it. Consider this. In 2010, CBS and Turner Broadcasting signed a 14-year deal to broadcast college basketball's championship tournament. The price tag? $10.8 billion. In 2016, they extended that deal for another 8 years for an additional $8.8 billion. That's $19.6 billion for 22 years of March Madness. The player's share of that money? Zero.
The athletes, in my opinion, deserve more because of the amount of money that they generate. Salaries are going up for everyone. Assistant coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, administration, all the way up the ladder. Everything is changing, monetarily for them, but the athletes still get right now what they got 40 years ago.
The system doesn't get changed because it works for all the people who are making the millions and millions and millions of dollars off the current system. Why would they want to share any of that money with the players when it all goes to them? I mean, that's really what the whole thing is about. There's a second reason the system doesn't change. We're talking about people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s overseeing people who are 18 and 19 and 20 years old. They're at the beginning of their careers. They all want to turn pro. None of them wants to be viewed as a troublemaker.
What you're taught as an athlete is to perform and keep your mouth shut. You know, be happy with your situation, your surroundings, and perform. And whenever you raise your eye at something, your eyebrow at something, and you have something to say, there will be backlash.
And there may even be a little bit of racism here. Because, you know, particularly if we're talking about football and basketball, you know, overwhelmingly the best collegiate players are black. And I think maybe you have a certain amount of white people maybe not so happy with a bunch of black guys making more money than they do.
Yeah, I think so, without a doubt. The rules are in place to keep those guys at that level so they can make the money for, you know, all the suits that watch from above.
And that's why it's so easy for those people to say, oh, they should be happy with the education they're getting. It's almost this idea of, you know, this sort of racist view, oh, well, the blacks aren't going to be educated, except because they're athletes, they will be educated, and they should be happy with that, which is ridiculous. But I think that's how some people in the U.S. think.
School administrators benefit financially from the current system, but professional sports leagues get something even more valuable, a free developmental league.
The NFL loves the system the way it is. It allows them to sort of scout players so they get a better feel for who's going to be good and who isn't, who they're going to draft and who they're not going to draft. And the NFL, which is the most ruthless of the sports leagues in the U.S., really has no desire to set up a minor league system and pay all that money to give players an alternative. The NBA seems more interested in setting up a minor league. And they do have it's called the G League, but they haven't really put a lot into it. And they pay the players about $35,000 each. And I believe that if they were willing to pay $60,000 to $70,000, I think they really could get most of the high school kids who don't want to go to college, but who have a chance to be pro players.
The U.S. courts have been unwilling to get involved, so if change does come, it will probably be from within.
I think what could happen is that the biggest conferences may eventually be the ones who will push to be allowed to pay players, to make sure they can get the best players and sort of leave everybody else behind. I could see conferences saying to the NCAA, just this conference and this conference that are the best should be allowed to pay their players, and they'll want to do that to get ahead of everybody else.
After 3 years in court, the case over individual marketing rights ended the way most lawsuits against the NCAA have.
Initially won in federal court. Judge Wilkin decided in our favor, but then eventually that was overturned. Both sides submitted paperwork to go to the Supreme Court, but Supreme Court didn't want to hear our case, and there it died.
Basically, the courts ruled that the NCAA's rules violated the antitrust laws of the United States. But the judges didn't have the nerve to take that to its logical conclusion. Well, if the rules are against the law, you get rid of the rules. But they were afraid to do that. Nobody wants to blow up the system. They don't know what's going to come next.
In the end, you know, everyone's going to see college sports for what it is. It's a money-making operation, and the people who are being used are not being paid, and they should be paid just like anyone else. Why shouldn't the best players get money that's commensurate with their abilities? And I think you're going to see that.
If and when those changes do come, all student athletes will owe a big thank you to a member of the 1995 national champions and his friend's teenage son.
I know, thinking back to my 17-year-old self, I know that person, that kid, would have wanted me to do this. So I had to, even if I didn't want to. I had to do this.
One of the reasons it's so hard to improve the college athletics system is that it's so decentralized. To get any kind of change made, you'd need the NCAA, all of the conferences, and each of the schools to play ball. And since they each have their own sizable revenue streams to protect, you can expect some healthy resistance. Coming up next, the days of flying scouts all over the world to watch teenage hockey players might be ending.
The scariest part is you may only see 5 games of one guy, so you could see his 5 best games, you could see his 5 worst games.
Stat heads take a lot of abuse. People that claim they can tell you everything about a player or a team just by looking at the numbers often get called nerds or geeks. But in the modern NHL, they are increasingly being called things like general manager.
Megan Chayka watches hockey differently than most fans.
Anytime a player touches the puck, it's tracked, it's recorded.
She has a long list of clients that want to get their hands on that information.
We have not only leagues, but teams, players, agents, trainers, media, digital, fantasy, you name it. You know, a lot of people use data for their different purposes.
The data her company Stathletes collects is often called analytics. It's the on-ice actions of players distilled into numbers. They use video analysis software to track every movement made by every player in every NHL game.
A really easy example would be just like passing. So if you make a pass, is it the forehand, backhand? Was a player under pressure? Was a player stick length away? What type of a pass? Was it rimmed? Was it banked? We would record all of that. And then as well, we would know who it was passed to, the length of it. Was it received? Was it received on the forehand, backhand? You could imagine how many iterations there can be of just even something simplistic.
Unit, and I thought he changed the game getting out into transition with that.
Monumental Sports, the owners of the Wizards and Capitals, use analytics for both teams.
Stats and data has obviously become increasingly important in both leagues. We have data scientists on both team ops units. We don't disclose how many pro or amateur scouts we have, but I will tell you that we are competitive, and so when our team ops leads, our general managers say that they need different tools, we provide those.
Not everyone in hockey embraces that approach.
Well, I mean, there's always old school pushback, and I think, you know, there's some people on completely one side of let's use data and quantify everything, and that's our decision. And then there's people that, you know, I've been in hockey for 50 years. This is my gut feel, and I'm going to keep going with that because I won 2 Stanley Cups in the 80s.
While also getting a chance at the NHL's 104 draft eligible evaluation.
Studying the numbers rather than relying on first-hand observations helps take bias out of the equation.
It's just human nature. If someone scores a game-winning goal or someone stops, it makes a big block. That can stick with you more than some of the little details that can win or lose games.
And then here's the 2-on.
For example, if a player gives up 3 odd-man rushes in a game, but the other team doesn't score, a viewer, even a trained scout, might discount them. Meanwhile, if another player on that same game gives up only 1 odd-man rush, but it results in the winning goal, he'll be labeled as a defensive liability.
I think probably the most surprising thing sometimes in stats is that you can have your own biases, and especially at a game that's so dynamic and fast-paced, and where there's so much pressure, you can have your own ideas of players that may or may not actually be true in the data. Your memory tricks you sometimes.
Analytic scouting can also be cheaper. Evaluating a teenage player in Eastern Europe, for example, no longer requires a major investment.
For scouts overseas, it's really hard to go to certain countries or find certain players, so we find that that data set can be more helpful. The scariest part is you may only see 5 games of one guy, so you could see his 5 best games, you could see his 5 worst games. What's the worst outcome? Maybe seeing the 5 best and drafting him, or seeing the 5 worst and you miss him. So being able to see his data for an entire season is incredibly important of understanding like sample sizes.
IBM is joining the party with their artificial intelligence project called Watson.
Watson can be trained to watch an athlete and pick up patterns, and that's great for training, it's great for scouting, and it also could be used for competitive advantage, right? How is a player moving? What are their tendencies? Do they always move right? Do they always move left? What do player expressions mean? What about player gestures, player rituals? What can those tell you, right? And so if you train Watson to watch those, you can watch them with your eye, and you can write down when this player, moves their right elbow, it means this. But you can really pick up things that the human eye can't see.
Moving forward, the use of analytics will only be limited by what questions teams ask and how they apply the answers. Because when it comes to measurement, there isn't much Megan and others like her don't see.
I don't think there's anything you can't measure that's performance-based. It would just be a function of cost and ability to tag players or record location, but I'd say anything is quantifiable that's on the ice.
After the break, algorithms that can analyze video are great for understanding players on the ice or on the court, but every day across all the leagues, there are hundreds of them not playing.
Predicting an injury is harder than actually winning the lottery, if you will, because it's almost like predicting the weather. The health of your athletes really determines performance. So anytime an athlete becomes injured, they're not able to play, and then huge financial implications because they're not going to be able to perform.
Huge financial implications is putting it mildly.
Start with the NHL, which lost roughly 6,500 man games to injury last season. At just under $30,000 per player per game, that's almost $200 million sitting in the trainer's room. The NBA has smaller rosters, but a similar number of injuries. Their players make more, so their loss is over $500 million. Baseball teams each lose an average of 1,000 man games a year. That's almost 30,000 for the entire league and a total cost of $800 million. And lastly, the NFL. Their players make the most money on a per game basis, so their total wasted cash is nearly $1 billion. In total, the Big Four pro sports leagues in North America paid $2.5 billion to players not playing. Some blame the schedule.
Once you get into a pro schedule, and let's say, for example, you're going to play 82 games, or Major League Baseball, you're going to play 162 games, there's very little time, maybe about 2 months, to be able to put them back together again for the following season.
The NBA took steps this year to address that problem.
So the idea was, let's shorten the preseason, right? Start the season a little bit earlier, avoid a lot of the back-to-back games, kind of like spread the games throughout a longer period for the purposes of actually reducing the number of injuries. But despite that great initiative or thought, we're actually kind of seeing that more injuries are actually occurring.
Tweaking the schedule hasn't delivered immediate results. That might be because most athletic injuries are cumulative in nature.
If we're talking about basketball players, one of the most common things are jumper knee problems. If the signature of how they jump, how they control their bodies is well developed, you're going to dramatically reduce the number of jumper knee problems in the future.
It all helps, but when it comes to player health, no one has a crystal ball.
Predicting an injury is harder than actually winning the lottery, if you will, because it's really about the prevention of injuries. Making sure that they're able to get onto the field is huge. We're talking about billions of dollars that are really lost because of injuries. And so the championship is ultimately determined because of who's least broken.
Usually, having a bunch of injuries will undermine a team's performance. But not so last year. The Los Angeles Dodgers led all of baseball in two categories: player games lost to injury and wins. After the break, the deal of the century features a player selected 76th overall in baseball's 2007 amateur draft. and his record-setting contract just a few years later.
The biggest contract ever signed between a team and a player is the deal between the Miami Marlins and Giancarlo Stanton. Stanton started his pro baseball career as a late second-round pick, 76th overall. His signing bonus was less than $500,000. But on November 19th, 2014, he got paid. He agreed to a 13-year contract worth $325 million. The average annual value, $25 million per season. But it's a backloaded deal. His salary peaks in the year 2023 when he'll make $32 million. That won't be the Marlins' problem, though. In December of 2017, just 3 years into the contract, the Marlins traded him to the Yankees. Coincidentally, Alex Rodriguez, who in 2001 signed what was then the richest contract in sports, a 10-year, $252 million deal with the Texas Rangers, was also traded to the New York Yankees, and that was exactly 3 seasons into that contract.
So here's what we know. In the battle between scouting and analytics, analytics are winning. Teams are replacing grizzled old scouts with young mathematicians. Those scouts used to say, "You don't understand the game unless you played it." Well, the new generation is trying to prove you don't even need to watch it.
I think it'll just get smarter, faster, better, more automation, more AI, machine learning. There's a lot of growth in technology that can happen to make it cheaper, because I think as much as we don't like to think about it, I mean, even minor hockey can be tracked and, little Jimmy can be evaluated.